and welcome to this taster lecture from the Department of Risk and Disaster Resilience here in UCL. So my name is Philip Cunliffe. I'm an associate professor in international relations here in the department. And today I'm going to be talking about who holds the power in humanitarianism as part of our series of taster lectures on topics that are currently connected to the work that we do here in the department. And all that said, the topic that I'm going to be speaking on today is something I never expected to be speaking on. It's still kind of utterly stunning to me in many ways, which is specifically Donald Trump's cancellation of USAID, the agency that was responsible for international humanitarian work, international development work on behalf of the US state. And this remarkable outcome is something, as I've stressed to my students this term, it's something, if you told me a few months ago, or I don't know, 4 or 3 months ago, or even the day before Donald Trump's official inauguration earlier this year, that he was going to cancel USAID, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have thought it was simply inconceivable, impossible, unlikely, not least because USAID has been understood as something which has been at the core of American interests in the world. And so the very fact that Donald Trump has tried to project a more self-interested vision of American politics, a more self-interested role for America in world affairs, it would have seemed a no-brainer that USAID would still be an important part of that project of defending America's interests. And so I wouldn't have expected it, and yet nonetheless it's happened. And so that is specifically what I would like to talk about: who holds the power in humanitarianism and what the consequences are, and to hook it over the question of Trump's challenge to humanitarian order. So one of the big questions that's where we talk about consistently in my lectures and in many of the kind of themes and discussions that we're having at the moment is when did the old era end and when did the new era begin in international affairs, the one we're thinking about at the moment? And some people say 2008 with the great financial crash, that's when things began to change. Other people say in 2016 with Donald Trump's first election and the Brexit vote here in the UK to withdraw from the European Union. Others say 2022 with the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I think as far as humanitarianism is concerned, we can probably draw a line under that era this year in 2024 with the cancellation of USAID. So that's what I'm going to talk about in more detail in this taster lecture. So it's without a doubt one of the most significantly charged and important decisions, I think, of the second Trump administration. And with that in mind, I think it's important to understand not only because it gives us a sense of what's coming, but also because I think it's going to transform the whole conduct and basis within which humanitarianism is understood, conceived, and practiced for a generation at least. I mean, the move was, the move for the cancellation of USAID. It was greeted with tremendous surprise, to put it mildly. It was momentous and unprecedented and completely unexpected, I think. And it sent shockwaves throughout Washington's foreign policy establishment, as well as the wider field of international humanitarianism and the non-governmental sector. And there was more than anything, more than the outrage and more than the anger and the frustration, it was surprise, I think, more than anything else. And what I want to suggest in this lecture is that rather than seeing the cancellation of the agency as an aberration or as an accident, we should rather see it as the culmination of a long-standing trend in international politics. And also, rather than simply seeing it as a kind of an opportunity or as the time for lamentation or distress, we should, I think, try to see it in terms of forcing us to address uncomfortable questions about the role of power in humanitarian decision-making, and more broadly, the contradictions that underpin the practices of our governments, of Western foreign aid, and also the enduring relevance of state sovereignty in an era in which global governance and non-state forms of political life were seen to be much more prominent. So instead of simply seeing Trump's cancellation as this kind of act of vandalism, I think it should be better understood as an assertion of a new kind of national interest politics against a foreign aid establishment that also was not only operating with respect to all of the various recipients on whom it depended, but also operated in a very particular way with respect to the American state and American citizens. And so to see aid not only as a one-way relationship between between the organization and the recipients or beneficiaries of the aid or humanitarian support that it provides, but also to see it in the context of national governments and national states as well. And this is something that Trump's decision kind of forces us or reminds us about and forces us to take into account. So I think the cancellation is a moment in which it lays bare the tensions at the heart of humanitarianism. And it underscores a very important lesson, which I think everyone who has any kind of interest in humanitarianism needs to remember, that aid is not just about benevolence, but also maybe even primarily about power. And that power is not only a question of how it's wielded over the people who receive aid, but also over the states themselves that where the aid is distributed. So it's a question of power that involves state machinery, governments, all sorts of government agencies, bodies, institutions, as well as the people who receive the humanitarian aid and support directly. And within all of those complicated layers kind of convoluted practices of international politics, we also have to remember that there are important questions about scrutiny and accountability and how that's managed within all of that complicated kind of network and hierarchy of institutions and agencies that are involved in humanitarian practice. So what I want to talk through then, having hopefully set the scene a bit for our listeners and viewers, I want to critically examine the implications of Trump's decision, and I want to do it by exploring several themes. Just to briefly remind ourselves about the history of USAID, to connect it to a long-standing crisis of legitimacy in Western humanitarianism. I want to briefly talk about the political economy of aid, how it functions in terms of its role in development. I want to talk about the meaning of power in humanitarian decision-making, and also then to conclude with a few thoughts on perhaps, despite the gloom surrounding the decision to cancel USAID, that perhaps there's also the possibility for renewal and revitalization of aid and humanitarian practice as a consequence. So I think one thing that's worth beginning with the history of the USAID, I think one thing that's worth remembering importantly is its origins in the Cold War. So that period of geopolitical tension between the capitalist West and the communist East between 1945 and the early 1990s. And we have to contextualize Trump's decision with that historic background in mind. Because once we understand the origins of USAID in that moment, then it also punctures the myth of benevolent power that I think is very easy to be taken over with if we don't think about or contextualize USAID in history. So it was established in 1961 under the Kennedy administration, and it was very explicitly conceived and understood as a vehicle for so-called soft power projection, as a way in which it was a tool that was understood that it was going to be used by the US in order to counter communist Soviet influence in the post-colonial world. And it was very much intended as a way of extracting loyalty from developing countries, from post-colonial states, and also entrenching in the process of that, also entrenching American influence, American ideology, and also America's economic interests. And so it's an important lesson, right? It's one that's often said, but nonetheless easily forgotten. That aid is not just about altruism. If it ever is about altruism, it's also a strategic tool. And USAID should be seen as something like the Marshall Plan, for instance, that was developed in the aftermath of the Second World War in order to rebuild, to reconstruct Western Europe, to fortify Western Europe against the spread of communism in that context. And so, in a similar way, the Marshall Plan is understood as this project of American largesse to reconstruct a devastated continent in the aftermath of war and of world war and occupation. And similarly, USAID needs to be understood not just as this generosity or benevolence, but also as a strategic tool as part of a geopolitical standoff in incredibly tense and difficult and polarized environment of international politics as it was during the Cold War. So USAID also functions as an extension of American geopolitical imperatives. And this was true across funding various development projects, across infrastructure programs, in the various projects of governmental reform and state building that it mounted. There was always the question that it was, or what drove those moves was promoting capitalist modernization, promoting geopolitical alignment with Western states, and in particular the US, and also solidifying the Western model of government, liberal democracy. So USAID was always political. That's the most important thing to remember about it. And despite these origins, nonetheless, over time, it's kind of USAID and Western humanitarianism more broadly has kind of become clouded with this idea or this mythology, I suppose, that developed around the practice of Western humanitarianism that portrayed it purely as a benevolent force, purely as this moral practice that was entirely divorced from power politics. And I think that illusion was easier to sustain across the last 30 to 40 years with the end of the Cold War. So when there was no longer any competition between the communist world and the capitalist world, it was easier, I think, to lull ourselves into this illusion or this to be taken in by this mirage that it was really just about well-meaning benevolence and about altruism. But when we consider the long history of USAID and the long history of the practice of aid, then it's the way in which it's intertwined with power politics cannot be avoided. So this illusion, like I say, was sustained partly by the end of the Cold War. And the removal of that geopolitical context and tension within which it had existed before, but also through the professionalization of the aid sector, and a world in which you had enormous expansion of the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, and a whole host of different international institutions that became increasingly involved in administering and overseeing development assistance. And so the result of that was an enormous bureaucracy of aid professionals, policy experts, think tanks, and various organizations and institutions. And all of them came to see themselves as being effectively above politics because there was no longer any geopolitical rivalry, no meaningful geopolitical competition, no ideological polarization. I think there was the development of a whole swathe of professionals who had overlooked or had failed to understand the fact that they were nonetheless still operating with politics, even if politics was less visible than it had been before. And so I think, nonetheless, in this period, from the end of the Cold War up until the present day, USAID came to be seen less as a tool of national interest and more as a kind of ideological institution that was about exporting liberal norms, and that this was part of what humanitarianism was about. Humanitarianism increasingly became seen to be something which was about building liberal democracy, and liberal democracy no longer understood as something which was about America's interest, but something that was about the world's interest, that was similarly altruistic, that was similarly apolitical, that was similarly neutral, that was similarly above ideology. So with that history in mind, then we can turn to the crisis of legitimacy in Western humanitarianism. And this is something which has been long going. I think it's been a long running problem in humanitarianism, is this sense of question of purpose and direction in the sector. And over the last few decades, we've seen deep contradictions in the practice of Western humanitarianism. So from Afghanistan to Haiti, from Iraq to Northern Africa, there's been repeated failures of state building projects that have been driven in one way or another by the support of aid. And billions, if not indeed trillions of dollars have been poured into various initiatives in order to rebuild state capacity in the aftermath of conflict and disaster. And yet the results to put it mildly, have been underwhelming, if not in some contexts, catastrophic and disastrous. And the most obvious example of this is obviously Afghanistan, in which USAID was heavily involved as a result of the US's own involvement in the country. And Afghanistan genuinely does stand as a damning indictment of this model which mixed together counterinsurgency, humanitarianism, and the promotion of aid. So USAID spent enormous quantities of money on democracy promotion, civil society promotion, on various governance initiatives, and all of this seemingly impressive structure, this entire kind of edifice, it crumbled away once the Americans announced their withdrawal in 2021 under the previous Joe Biden administration. This very seemingly expensive kind of edifice crumbled away and was revealed to be little more than a facade, kind of something like a Potemkin village, which had been thrown up for the benefit of aid donors and outside observers and journalists, but was not something which had really established any meaningful roots in Afghan society. And so the Afghan government, which had been propped up effectively by outside military support and foreign aid and international advisors, it had no effective basis in society. And there we have the classic example of the pernicious effect of international aid, where rather than strengthening the Afghan state, it in fact had weakened it. So you had a state that was more oriented towards outside support rather than cultivating relations with its own society and the people that it was supposed to represent. And so in that context, it was simply far too weak to be able to sustain itself once the plug was pulled. And so it simply had no, because it didn't extract revenue or taxes from its society in a way in return for the provision of security. Rather, it depended on the resources provided by the aid industry from abroad and by the security provided by NATO and US forces, meant that it was entirely dependent and effectively an artificial regime that was incapable of withstanding the return of the Taliban. Another example, which I think draws attention to this crisis within Western humanitarianism, would be Haiti. So it's another case study of a cycle of interventions, of waves of aid, of various foreign-led initiatives that have tended to, the cumulative effect of which has been to leave Haiti, in fact, more dysfunctional, more poverty-stricken, and more stagnant than before. And again, USAID was involved in distributing enormous amounts of resources to Haiti, and yet the vast majority of the population, it goes without saying, remains in dire poverty. And so I want to draw attention. I mean, these are two very kind of striking examples of failure, but I want to draw attention to them because I think they point to a crisis at the core of Western humanitarianism. And it's not to say that it's not the lesson of Haiti and Afghanistan is not that aid always fails or that aid is ineffective, but rather that aid that is skewed in a particular geopolitical way and that doesn't align with the political reality of both the international context and the domestic context of the societies in which the aid is being distributed, means that it will, when it operates like that, it will fail. And it reinforces the central lesson, which is the idea that development can be driven externally, that it can be driven through technocratic governance, which has no meaningful democratic legitimacy, and also that these societies can be remotely engineered from afar. All of that is a fantasy. And it's a fantasy because it ignores the central questions of political legitimacy, of political power, and also of state capacity. So moving on to the next theme I wanted to briefly review in this lecture was the political economy of aid, and specifically how it erodes state sovereignty. And this is, we've mentioned this with respect to Afghanistan in particular, but I wanted to draw it out a bit more. So it's an overlooked aspect of the question of aid is how it impacts state capacity in the host country where aid is distributed, but also the overlooked aspect is what the consequence is for the donor states as well. And I think this is particularly important in light of Trump's decision to effectively nix the department or the agency. So for recipient states, as we talked about with Afghanistan and Haiti, aid often functions as a form of external governance, external oversight. And this is imposed through various conditionality agreements, structural adjustment programs historically in Africa, and also various kinds of governance reforms which are imposed by donors. And all the effect of all of this is to strip countries of any meaningful political agency, of any genuine sovereignty, and it effectively makes them align with externally driven priorities. And the knock-on effect of that is that often it also means that you get the entrenchment of local elites who remain dependent on this foreign aid, and it creates this political caste, effectively, who rely on extraction of foreign resources rather than catering or ministering to the needs of their own populations. So that part of the relationship, I think, is, that's well understood, and it's understood as a common problem in state building and in aid and development projects. It's the other side of the equation that I think is overlooked, and one which I want to also think about today, which is how it also erodes the sovereignty of the donor states. Because the consequence obviously is that when you have enormous amounts of resources channeled through through aid agencies, international ministries for development, as we used to have in the UK, or USAID in the US, you also develop an elite who is effectively shielded from democratic scrutiny in the donor state. And so despite the fact that there's widespread, the opinion polls show there's often widespread skepticism towards large-scale foreign assistance programs, as well as the long history of their dysfunction and maladministration. Nonetheless, there's been, this powerful set of powerful bureaucratic layers that have managed to shield themselves from the consequences of their failures in these countries. And so you have the proliferation of a large swathe of administrators, professionals, experts, technical professionals of all kinds who've effectively been able to maintain the status quo despite its manifest and repeated failures in the developing world, and also to shield themselves from outside scrutiny. So importantly, I think we'll not be able to get to the root of what happened with USAID unless we understand why it was popular with Trump supporters. And from the Trumpian point of view, it wasn't just a rejection. It wasn't a rejection of foreign aid so much as an assertion of democratic control over an establishment that was seen to be remote from the concerns of ordinary Americans. So it was an acknowledgement, in effect, that aid is currently structured. It does not serve the interests of the American people, but rather promotes a kind of an elite-led vision of international engagement. And that, I think, has to be understood as how Trump has managed to do it, and to do it in such a way that is seen to be popular with his base. And until that reality is acknowledged, I think it'll be very difficult to conduct aid in a way that is meaningful, or to rebuild it in a post-Trumpian world. So that takes us to the question of the meaning of power in humanitarian decision making, and it sort of circles us back to the present and back to the role of Donald Trump in particular. And the fundamental lesson, I think, which is underscored by Trump's decision, is that humanitarianism is not something that's separate from power, but is rather an expression of power. The very ability to provide aid, and to set the agenda for what development initiatives look like, to define what other societies should do and can do, that in itself is an exercise of power. And so it's a mistake for us to think of humanitarianism, to see it in apolitical terms, or to see it purely as a moral duty that exists outside the realm of geopolitics, or outside the realm of strategic considerations, or outside the realm of state interests. We've been able to do that for a long time in the last 30 to 40 years, because it's been a world that's been absent of geopolitical rivalry. It's not had significant contestation between powerful states over the shape and future of world order. And so it was easier in that context to think of humanitarianism as something apolitical. And the consequence of that is that the aid establishment was able to operate with restricted accountability, and also to present itself as the arbiter of global development, and to dismiss all challenges to its authority, despite the fact that the record of humanitarian aid and development has been patchy at best over the last 30 to 40 years. And nonetheless, it was able to maintain its influence by castigating any challenge to it in some way as being bigoted or parochial or nationalistic. And so I think in that context, it's important to remind ourselves that it was, we live in a new world as a consequence, but also that we understand that aid has been extraordinarily political and extraordinarily important to the exercise of power since the inception of USAID in the 1960s. So Trump's rejection of this model of global governance, this global governance model of aid and development, it's not a rejection, I think, of America having a role in the world, but rather a rechanneling of the way in which that power is exercised, and that it's more explicitly channeled through America's self-interest and defended in terms of America's self-interest, rather than operating at this neutral level or this apolitical level, separate from questions of geopolitics. So what comes after USAID? Now, needless to say, the end of the American agency does not mean the end of foreign assistance, but it does mean a significant shift in how we should think about aid and conceptualize it. And I don't have any answers in this lecture, but only to indicate that the question is posed to us now, and that it's something that we urgently need to start thinking about, rather than simply allowing ourselves to be paralyzed by frustration or anger with the actions of the Trump administration. So the first lesson, I think, is that we're likely to see an increased explicitly political form of aid. Going back, in fact, to the origins of USAID in the 1960s, where assistance, aid, humanitarian assistance will be more directly tied to national interests rather than abstract humanitarian goals. And so I think you could see more aid, which is seen to be more bilateral, built around bilateral agreements, and it might be built around investments, or around, say, building development around trade, rather than on grant-based assistance of the old model. I think it could also lead to a resurgence of state-led development strategies across the post-colonial world, or the global South, as it's sometimes called, And this has, again, been something that's been happening for a while, that Western-led aid institutions and development institutions have increasingly been challenged by the provision or the offer of development assistance from China. So with their Western aid institutions in decline, we see the many countries turning to alternative models and to state-driven development, regional cooperation, and reliance also on the willingness of countries like China, but other countries as well, such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia, to provide different kinds of assistance and different kinds of development. And then finally, I would say the broader ideological implications of Trump's decision should also be thought about, which is it's a shift away from what's been called the liberal international order, which has dominated Western foreign policy for many, many years, as I've stressed throughout the course of the lecture. And what we're going to see instead is a return to a more state-centered model of international politics based around national sovereignty, and also as is often been used to characterize the Trump administration, a transactional approach to international relations. So one which is based, rather than on the constructing grand edifices of international order, it's more based on deal making between countries, either independently or in the context of a particular regional forum. But it's much more kind of hub and spokes model, rather than building grand kind of architectural visions of international order and what it looks like. So I think to draw the lecture to a close, I think in the current context we should think of it. We should draw the hard conclusion from Trump's cancellation of USAID, which is to take it as an opportunity for us to recognize the fact that humanitarianism is not above politics, and that aid is not neutral. And at the same time, that we cannot outsource basic decisions about our national choices and our national interests to their unelected and unaccountable forms of global authority. So it's a moment that forces us to reckon with certain basic realities. And those realities are that state sovereignty remains a foundation of political order. And as long as it is the foundation of political order, it requires us to think about how we manage aid and humanitarianism with that world which is based around independent nation states. So the Trump's move to cancel USAID is not simply the rejection of an agency, but the rejection of an entire way of thinking about power and governance and international relations. And within that, I think I want to conclude on a hopeful note, which is to say that I think it offers an opportunity for aid to be renewed. And rather than for humanitarianism to be entangled within Western practices of power, it also opens up the opportunity, perhaps, for aid for independent agencies, what are called the classic donantist agencies in humanitarianism, perhaps to have greater scope for their role and to restore more classical ideals of humanitarianism based on independence, on neutrality, on impartiality. And perhaps that's an opportunity and a positive outcome from the cancellation of USAID. So thank you very much for your attention.